did you? Anything you want.
All right, go for it.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's V, the Guerrilla Economist, and we are live again with the one and only Harley Schlanger. Harley, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Great to have you back, my friend. And folks, if you don't know who Harley is the clarion voice of reason in this crazy, tumultuous world. He comes very well experienced, as he's always talking to dignitaries, politicians, world leaders all over the world. He really has his finger to the pulse of what's really going on. And you can find him on the LaRouchePact.com, or the SchillerInstitute.org, the SchillerInstitute.org. And with that being said, Harley, what is the hot button topic for today, sir?
Well, I think there are two aspects that we should discuss. First is that the revolt in the population against the establishment continues. We see this coming to a head in Europe as the Brexit is nearing the dead-end bridge. Either England or the EU or both are about to go all over the bridge into the water, uncharted waters. The rebellion continues. There's in the United States, the population is getting whipsawed around this liberal left axis on the one side and then the neoliberals on the other. But I would call people's attention to something that is quite serious, which is that there's a rebellion in the Republican Party against Trump, which is the Bush Republicans. And we saw it in a couple things this week. There's a vote on NATO where it's a non-binding resolution, but it says Trump can't pull the troops out of NATO. Then a vote on Syria, again non-binding, but it says that we should not withdraw from Syria. And then just as Trump is honing in on a deal with China, the bipartisan leadership in the House and Senate are crafting a bill against Huawei, ZTE, and other Chinese tech conglomerates.
Yeah.
So you have an all-court pressure coming from, of course, the Democrats, but also McConnell's in on it, people like Tom Cotton, Ben Sasse, who you can always count on.
A list of wonderful neocons, especially that Cotton. Ugh.
Yeah. And then you have the appointment of Mr. Iran-Contra, Elliot Abrams, to head up the Venezuela coup. And in the background, and I really think people should get this image in your head, behind all of this, the Democratic Party revolt and the Republican revolt, is the ugly face of George Soros, who laid out in Davos what his intention is. Regime change, not just in Venezuela, not just in Syria and Ukraine, but regime change in Russia, China, and the United States. He said that explicitly, that Russia, China, and the United States are headed by leaders who are authoritarian and have to be removed. And this from a man who's one of the arch criminals in the world, who has no remorse whatsoever about plunging 100 million people in Indonesia into dire poverty when he pulled the plug on the Indonesian currency, or in Malaysia or Thailand with the 1997 Asia crisis, who has no problem shorting the dollar, shorting the pound. So this is a guy who then takes the money he makes from this and funds wild anarchists like the Antifa, unhinged leftists like the Ocasio-Cortez from your neck of the woods. And then also, he's very much involved in promoting the Elliot Abrams operation against Venezuela.
A wonderful, bright and shining star that Elliot Abrams is, Harley.
Well, remember, he was, I believe, convicted for lying to Congress.
Twice.
What was he lying about? He was lying about the U.S. moving drugs and arms to dictatorships, in drugs into the United States. under the leadership of George Herbert Walker Bush. And this was detailed recently in an article by Seymour Hersh, which none of the U.S. press would touch. But it was in the London Review of Books called The Vice President's Men. And it's about how G.H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., whatever you want to call him, the late unlamented George Herbert Walker Bush, was running an operation behind Reagan's back through people who referred to Reagan as a dimwit and lazy. This was an operation that, as I said, was identified in the San Jose Mercury News as bringing drugs into Los Angeles, cheap cocaine into Los Angeles to launch the crack epidemic in the early 80s there. To do what? To fund an operation which the Congress said was illegal. That's the Bush machine. And that's where people like McConnell and Cotton and Sassy, and then on top of that, you can throw in Schumer, supposedly a left liberal, but he's a Wall Street neoliberal.
Right.
So this is a gang. It's a laundry list of criminals, but they're moving now as we approach the State of the Union to try to put Trump in a corner and to trap him into non-winnable situations where they can then pull a string here, pull a string there, and next thing you know, the net falls down on Trump and he's out the door. And we either have President Pence or President Pelosi.
Yeah, exactly.
So
and
I'm not predicting that's going to happen. I'm just saying if we, the American people, fall asleep on the job, that's the strategy. That's already in the works. And you saw it with the Worldwide Threat Assessment report delivered by another gang of criminals, Coates, Haspel, and Ray, who disputed everything, every policy the president has on foreign policy. You know, Trump is going to meet with Kim Jong-un to move ahead the negotiations with North Korea, and these guys said denuclearization will never happen. On Syria, Trump is saying we've defeated ISIS. We're working with others to finish them off. And they say ISIS is growing, ISIS is expanding. And of course, they should know because this is the network, especially the CIA, that helped to create ISIS. But they're saying that the homeland itself is threatened by this new form of ISIS. And why is this happening? Because Trump is putting an end to the U.S. involvement in the wars in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So this is a gang that on their own couldn't shoot straight, but they can do a hell of a lot of damage. And then you have Bolton, who's a serial killer of arms control negotiations, who just convinced Trump to pull the plug on the INF treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. Now, Trump himself said, look, this is a bad treaty. It's not going to work. We're going to get a better treaty. Now, of course, that's what he said on NAFTA. That's what he said on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. On some of these things, he is moving in that direction. And maybe if he's allowed to meet with Putin, we could see some motion in the direction of an arms control agreement. But the problem is, as long as Mueller and his crew of hacks and destroyers are on the loose, Trump is going to hold off meeting with Putin. And as a result, we may be finding ourselves in a new arms race and on a short path toward a simple mistake that could lead to the annihilation of most of the planet.
Yeah. Right, exactly. In Europe, we're seeing a lot of movement over there. They've set up the SVP, special vehicle, the special purpose vehicle, the SPV, for trade with Iran. We're seeing a lot of development happening in that regard. We're seeing the U.S. Just globally being snubbed. Everywhere from, Venezuela, Russian troops have agreed to work with Venezuelan troops, so any sort of movement forward in Venezuela from the U.S. neocon side, it's not going to go. It's going to go the way of Syria. There's no way they're going to, do anything. And I think Maduro will endure. I mean, Harley. Ever since this whole Russia collusion nonsense, the frothing, mad, lithium-starved liberals have gone insane. how is this affecting foreign policy? How is this making us look into the rest of the world that we are absolutely schizophrenic at this point? I don't think there's a country in the world out there that trusts us, Harley.
Well, I think you're right. I think there are some people like Merkel and others who pretend they don't like Trump, but they're more than happy to see the United States go through some chaos because it takes away from the chaos here in Germany. But look, you're right about one thing in particular, which is that Russiagate is at the heart of our problems. Were Trump left to do what he said he wants to do, that is sit down with Putin, maybe over a couple of days, and have some talks on how the U.S. and Russia can work together, they could craft something, as they talked about in Helsinki. And of course, remember how the media, the liberals and the conservatives went crazy over Trump and Putin talking in Helsinki. What were they talking about? He told us. They just weren't paying attention. He said they were talking about how to avoid a new arms race.
Yeah.
And in his press conference, Trump said, we're spending $780 billion a year on defense. Isn't that ridiculous? We have to, but if we had agreements, we could use that money to rebuild roads, railroads, schools, hire more teachers, and so on. But he's not allowed to do it, because if he talks to Putin, he's proving he's a Putin puppet who's trying to put Putin in a penthouse apartment in a Trump tower in Moscow in return for Putin rigging the U.S. election for Trump. The story is so preposterous.
Yeah.
We've had a year and a half of supposedly the best prosecutors in the United States working on it. And what do they turn up with? Roger Stone lying to Congress, Papadopoulos allegedly giving the wrong date and talking about a meeting with a professor who isn't even Russian, who was the one who told Papadopoulos that the Russians have these documents, not the other way around. They've come up with nothing. But in the meantime, as you pointed out, they have perverted foreign policy so that Trump is not able to move ahead to accomplish what he wants to. As a result, in order to appease the calls for being tough on Putin, he's adopted some sanctions. He shot some missiles into empty warehouses in Syria. He didn't really do a whole lot. When he says he's tough on Russia, not a whole lot has happened, except he hasn't had the chance to meet with Putin and work things out. Now, on China, the same thing's underway. There was this 2-day meeting last week in Washington with Lighthizer and Larry Kudlow and Wilbur Ross and others on the American side, and Liu He, who is the architect of Xi Jinping's economic policy, which means he's a fairly bright guy, talking about how to resolve these trade imbalances and more importantly, to come up with some ideas for structural reform in China, which will not include the change in the banking system. They will not accept an American-style speculative casino banking system. But other than that, they're open for talking on all these fronts, and Trump afterwards was very happy about it. But what happened while this meeting's going on? 23-count indictment against Huawei on dubious charges that have been refuted by a number of leading cyber experts. So, and where did that come from, by the way? The Justice Department and the National Cyber Security Center of the GCHQ in Britain. And Australia, New Zealand, Canada are all in on it. So we see this British empire working through the neocons and the neoliberals to sabotage Trump's efforts to do something on foreign policy. Now, we're lucky we haven't had a war yet. And I think part of the reason we haven't is that Trump has built up a certain personal rapport with Xi Jinping, which Xi wrote in a letter to Trump that was just delivered last week, how much he appreciates their personal relationship, and Trump was just ecstatic to receive the letter. And secondly, there are discussions going on with the Russians, mainly through the military channels in both countries, that is keeping the peace, you might say. But as I pointed out in a recent article, Trump is trying to do things that haven't been done by a president since some of this was Reagan tried to do, but more of it was what John Kennedy was trying to do when he was killed. And the people who killed Kennedy, who were behind the Kennedy assassination and cover-up, are the same networks that are running this operation against Trump. And it includes people like Elliott Abrams and Obama and Brennan and Clapper and all these guys. And Trump's best protection would be to declassify not just the Russiagate documents, but 9/11 documents, including ones that would implicate Mueller, would include declassifying documents going back to the 4 assassinations in the 1960s of the 2 Kennedys, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Let's get the truth out there. Let's let Americans see who our real enemies are. The Russians didn't do any of these assassinations. The Chinese didn't. The whole Russiagate was run by the British, not the Russians. So let's get the truth out there. And one other point on this, and I was just reviewing the whole Roger Stone case, and Roger's accused, the main accusation against him is that he did what he always does, opposition research. He heard there was some dirt on Hillary and he tried to find out what it was. Now, if that's a crime, what about the Christopher Steele dossier? What about the Clinton campaign paying an MI6 operative to make up stories on Trump based on relying on Russian intelligence operatives? Now, how come that's not a crime if Roger Stone trying to find out what's in the WikiLeaks file is a crime? So, we're looking at a world turned upside down by corruption. And the sooner these documents are declassified, the sooner we're going to have a chance to give the American people the truth.
Very well said, Harley. Very well said. Last but not least, relations, trade situations with China and the U.S. Do you see it being resolved? Do you see that this year we could possibly see an end to all the shenanigans?
Well, there's less than a month now to come up with the so-called global agreement with China. From what I know, there was progress made in the talks in Washington, but there's still some sticking points, and some of this has to do with ideological sticking points of the neoliberals, who are basically saying that if China insists on having government funds going into some of these companies that are building these projects, that's unfair competition. Well, that's what we used to do. When we were a great country, who built the TVA? It was private companies, but where did the seed capital come from? Who rebuilt the country in the Depression? It was through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which had private funds, but it also had government capital. So the idea that China is competing unfairly, which is what Lighthizer and Navarro and others are saying, is a fraud. That's a piece of neoliberal dogma. And under that neoliberal dogma, what we will see is more speculation, more risk, more funny money. And by the way, we wouldn't be complete if we didn't point out that the Europeans have gone back to a high degree of quantitative easing now. The European economies are trending backwards. They're going to zero growth or below that. And so the solution from Brussels is what? More free money. And the free money is going to backstop the bad debt of corporations and the banks not to go into the real economy and to produce. Now, we see the same thing with Jerome Powell. Trump was right to jawbone him and tell him to back off these high interest rates. But low interest rates alone are not a solution because that money is going into the speculative bubble. And this is where John Kennedy had a good idea, which is that you can give corporations tax breaks and credit, provided they direct it to real physical production, plant and equipment, research and development, worker training, education programs, things that will produce new wealth in the future, increase productivity, and as a result of that, increase the profitability of the company so they can pay back the loans. Otherwise, you have companies borrowing money at no interest to buy more debt, to buy more stocks, to prop up a bubble. So, again, I think this is where we could learn something from the Chinese, who are also creating credit, but it's going into tangible production.
Yep, very well said. Harley, thank you so much for being on with us. And once again, folks, you can find him on schillerinstitute.org and larouchepack.com. Harley, it's always a pleasure, sir. Thank you so much.
All right. Talk to you next week, Fig.
You got it, sir. Bye-bye.